Welcome to yet another video on Java Spring Security. Today we are going to discuss on the real interview questions which are asked in the Spring Security interview. So whether you are preparing for any interview in general, or whether you are specifically looking out for a Spring Security interview related questions, what kind of questions are asked. This video is about discussing those particular questions, and in this video you will find top 10 questions which are asked in the interview. So these are all the practical and the real interview questions which are gathered and actually myself experienced in the interview. So let's without wasting time, let's jump into it. So the very first basic questions which is asked in interview questions, uh, after let's say the section of Java, Spring Boot and other sections, you will see, like, when it comes to Spring Security interview questions, this is the basic question which is asked. So what is the Spring Security in Spring Boot basically? So now when it comes to Spring Security, right, in Spring Boot, right, it's one of the powerful and the highly customizable framework, right? So which you can add by authentication and the authorization to your Spring Boot application. So basically it is very important and very crucial when you're building and trying to secure your web applications or any APIs. Now inside Spring Security, there are different components or different parts in it. So very first thing is authentication. So this is the basic process of, like, trying to verify who the user is basically, right? Typically, it will involves the user providing some credentials like username and password, or basically when you're trying to check against certain data source like a database, or let's say LDAP, right? This particular user exists or not, right? So Spring Security, when it supports various kind of authentication mechanisms. So here are the few of them. So one is using the username and password, which we already discussed. So this is one of the most common approach, and there is another way which is OAuth 2. So this is basically used with the help of the third-party authentication. So you have to log into any of this particular third-party application that is using Google or Facebook or any GitHub, right? So you have to log in over there, and then you will be successfully authenticated. SAML, this is called SAML. So this is one of the SSO based authentication. So it is used in the enterprise environments, basically where you have multiple applications, and then you want that particular single sign-on to be enabled, and then from that particular single sign-on, you can navigate to different applications. JWT, this is also called as JSON Web Token. So this is one of the popular methods for let's say when you are invoking service to service micro communication. You want to authenticate that particular stateless using the authentication, right? So especially when you are dealing with REST APIs, right? So you can authenticate this particular using the JSON Web Token. So this is one of the popular way, and also it is one of the popular interview questions which are asked, like how do you secure your microservices, or how do you secure between the service to service communication. Now the next component is inside that Spring Security is authorization. Now after you have authenticated that particular user, right, the next step is about determining what that user is allowed to do, right? So basically uh, now first step was, like, who the user is. Now the second step is what he can access, right? So granting and denying certain specific resources or the functionality, this is taken care over here. Now Spring Security provide role-based authorization as well, and also permission-based authorization. Now, if you see, you see at the role-based authorization, so you have to assigning some roles to the you are assigning users some roles, right, like admin, user, and then you are granting based on certain these roles only, right? So all the users which are tagged to this particular roles will be authorized, and you will be allowed to access these particular resources. Now we have some permission based usage also, which is a kind of fine grained control which is based on the access based on the specific permissions basically. Okay, so you have certain specific permissions which are given to certain specific users or such, based on certain criteria, right? So that's all about authorization. Now when it comes to security context, now spring security, it also uses a security context holder, so which is going to store the current authenticated user. So whatever in the step one what we discussed about the authentication, right, that particular user information is particularly stored in it, right? Now this information will have principal details, the authorities details, etc., right? So this information is available throughout the application wherever it is required, so that you allow to have some personalized user experience, or either you restrict certain access to certain part of the applications, right? So that's the reason this particular information is available throughout the application, so that in wherever the user is trying to navigate or trying to see, there itself it can be restricted. Now there are certain filters. So this is one of the core part of it. It is built on top of that particular chains of filters basically. So each request which is going to pass through these particular filters, right, which will perform certain various security tasks, like so there are different filters. So one of them is username user password authentication filter, now which is going to handle the username password based logged in, right? So this is used in that particular context. Now there is authorization filter as well, which will have some certain authorization rules, right? Now this is CSRF filter also, now which is this is used for cross site request forgery attack. So this is which will protect against that. So when any this kind of attacks which has to go through this particular filter, and then you can actually define those particular security mechanism over here. Now logout filter, so basically you are handling your logout request, right? So what has to be done here when you're clicking on the logout, right, or in certain time frame, right, you can do this, you can handle this particular thing. So now there is a user detail services. This interface, this is an interface basically, and which is responsible for loading the user details basically, either username and password and roles related details, which are either from the data source, right? So typically you implement this particular interface to to connect your Spring Security to your either database or some user stores basically. Okay, to get that information. Now there is another component which is equally important, that is password encoder. Now this is very crucial when it comes to Spring Security, because it requires you to hash that particular password before you store it somewhere, right? So it's very important you doesn't store that particular password in a plain text. So password encoder, which is an interface which will handle this particular thing. So you make sure that you never store your password in a very plain text. For Spring Security, with this particular implementation of like bcrypt password encoder, for you will have a very strong password hashing basically. So this is one of the way. Now the very second question which is asked, or mostly asked, is that what are the core components of this Spring Security and how do you work together with them, right? Now Spring Security, when it comes to the core, it lies in the filter chain. We already discussed there are different kind of filter chains. Now as the request passes on this particular request, the chains of the filters, right, each filter is responsible for certain different security task, right? Now it has got its own responsibility, and it has got for its own functionality basically. So the very first thing is security context holder. Now this will store, what it will store is that it will store the current authentication detail we already discussed. But there is an authentication manager which is going to handle the authentication request, right? Which will handle the authentication which we have done earlier. Authentication provider, now this is the actual authentication, like checking the username and password, which is going to happen over here, right? Granting authority, now representing certain user roles or permissions, right? You will get those particular details over here. User detail services, this will load the user related details like username, password, what kind of authority he has, right? We already discussed about filters like username, password filters, username, password, authentication filter, authorization filter. We can handle certain specific security aspects over here. Okay. Uh, Now, if you look at this particular flow, right, the very first thing is that the user requests something, right, and then it lands to the certain filters. Basically, we already discussed, right, username, password filter, then other different filters over there. Then it goes to the authentication manager. Then it goes to the authentication provider. Then it comes to the authentication, like whether it is based on that particular authentication provider, like whether the authentication is successful or failure, right? If it is successful, then it will, and in the next step, like if there is certain security context holder if you have implemented, right? If after the successful things actually, then it comes authorization, and finally, after the authorization is complete, you are able to access that particular request. You will get the response basically. Now, how do you implement the role-based authentication in security? Now, this is very commonly asked and also the most frequently asked actually. Uh, so, role-based authentication basically it is achieved using the configuration authorities. Now, there are some roles, and by using them with the authorization expression basically. So, you have certain different roles. You can define certain roles in a several different ways actually. So one mechanism is about database. Now you can store the roles in either in database and load them by using the user detail services. This is one of the I would say common way, but it is not recommended as of, because to nowadays we are using less with respect to the username password, because we are using some different ways to spend. Now, in-memory database also, in-memory also is there. So you can define certain roles directly in the spin security configuration itself, right? So in that particular in-memory, it will be available to it. Now there are method level security as well. We can annotate certain annotations like at the rate reauthorize, which will have certain roles like admin, it is a user, which will restrict certain access to certain specific methods basically. So with this particular configuration, you can use this authorization authorize HTTP request method, and you can send specify certain request rules basically. So if you see here, you have defined the authorized HTTP request, then there is a some request matcher, and then it has got some has roles. Then request method, then is also if there is certain any of this particular role for this particular URL basically, right? So any request it will be authenticated. Now, what is the difference between authentication and authorization? Now, this is one of the important question, and also this will give the interviewer that you are confident that you have already knowing the spring security concepts, and you are well aware of what exactly these concepts are, right? Because very it has been seen that some people get confused, and also they are not able to answer this particular questions, right? So what exactly is the authentication means? Now basically this is something which will indicate that this is verified that who the user is about, like what is the username and password. It is a process of identifying particular who that particular user is about, right? Now the second thing is about authorization. Now this particular will determine the user which is logged in or which is authenticated earlier in the step one is allowed to do certain activities or access certain specific resources or not. So it is about granting certain permissions to that particular user on his roles or certain authorities, right? Then based on that, you will be authorized to access those particular resources. So authentication comes before the authorization. So you must be authenticated in order to have a certain authority to access certain resources, right? So that is the basic difference. Now, how do you secure your Spring Boot REST APIs using the Spring Security? Now, there are when you're dealing with REST APIs, right, it is often stateless. Right? You have to deal with the stateless authentication mechanisms like JWT token, that is JSON Web Token, or either you can use OAuth2 as a result. So now, when you're using JWT, so after you are successfully authenticated at the very step one, the server will what will do is that it will issue a JWT token to the particular client which has requested it. The client will include the JWT token whichever it is got in the first request in the authorization header of the subsequent request which is going to send for the second time, right? Now the server, what it will do is that when the request again lands for the second time, it will validate that particular JWT token with the to authenticate the particular user is authenticated or not. Okay, so that is where it will be checking that. Now the when you're using OAuth2, right, this is kind of more comprehensive authorization framework which is often used with the third party accesses, like as we already discussed, right? So Spring Security, when it provides, it supports both mechanism which is using JWT as well as OAuth2, right? So you can configure the filters or to certain intercept certain requests. You can validate the token, then you can then set the authentication in the security context holder. Okay. Now, what is this CSRF protection and how does this Spring Security handle? Now, many in the many interviews I've seen that this particular thing is not known to them. They are not well aware of this particular CRSF concept, right? Now, what exactly this CSRSF concept is about? This is one of the malicious attack. This is called cross-site request forgery. So in this attack, what happens is that a malicious website will kind of trick that it is a logged in user which is trying to perform certain unwanted actions to the other websites basically. So this is kind of a malicious way to do that. Now Spring Security, it has gotten built-in or by default this particular CSR is a protection. Now it works by including the token, that is a CSR RSF token in the request itself. So usually it is hidden in the form field or either in the hidden section. Now this what happens, the server when the request what if the server will verify that the particular token which has been received on the subsequent request, so it will verify against that thing. Now this will prevent certain malicious attacks or malicious sites from kind of forging that particular request on behalf of certain genuine users, right? So if it is only the genuine user, it will only allow that because this particular token is only issued to them, right? Now there is also a way to disable this particular CSRF token protection if you want it, but this is not recommended because this will lower your security when it comes to security aspect, right? So never disable it. Now, how do you implement the custom login and logout functionality within the Spring Security? Now, there are two things inside it. One is custom login functionality and one is custom logout. So basically, you can customize that particular login page, like the authentication process. You can handle certain the error handling way, right? This will involve certain configurations, like you can use user password authentication filter, or you can create certain custom authentication filter. You need to either use user detail services to fetch certain user details from the data source, right? Now when it comes to custom logout, right, you can also customize that particular logout screen process, right? Or you can either redirect that particular URL, and you can also invalidate that particular session. So Spring Security will provide a logout filter for this particular purpose, and you can do this particular activity over there. Now, what is this method level security when it comes to Spring Security, right? And how do you use it? Now, method level security is nothing but you are securing certain individual methods within your beans, right? Within your Spring beans. So you want that particular certain methods to be accessed by certain roles, or which are certain roles are allowed. Certain you can define certain annotation like at the rate Spring authorize, you can spring post authorize, and then at the rate secure, at the rate role based. So with this you can define certain roles and access rules for it. So this in here is an example how we can define at the top of that particular method level. So in order to that, only admins are allowed to access this particular page, because certain, let's say you want to delete some user, right? So not all particular user can have access that. Only admin person can have that particular access to that, or the admin which has got the role, right? That only can do this particular activity. Not every user. Now, how do you handle exceptions in Spring Security? So, Spring Security will provide in general, the mechanism for handling the authentication and authorization, basically, right? For the exceptions, right? Now, you can configure the authentication entry points to handle certain authentication failures. Example, like redirecting to the login page again if there is certain if there is some exception over there. You can also use at the rate controller advice and or with the help of at the rate exception handler to handle the exception which is globally, which is happening anywhere in the application, right? So in this way you can handle your exceptions globally, and also using the at the where you are trying to authenticate the user as well. Now, what is the purpose of this particular password encoder? We already discussed. This is an interface basically which is used for hashing the password. Now, you are storing something in a, let's say, earlier you used to store the particular password in a plain context text, right? So it is kind of a majority security risk actually. So by implementing this particular password encoder like bcrypt password encoder or password encoder factories, which will have some creative delegation password encoder, right? Which will provide a secure way to store and compare the password as well. So you make sure you never store your password in a plain text. It has to be encrypted. Now, how do you configure Spring security in Spring application? Now, Spring Boot, when it comes to auto configuration, right, will provide the Spring security. There is a Spring security starter dependency which you can include in the class path, that is founded XML. Now you can also customize that particular Spring security configuration by either creating the class that will extend the web security configure adapter. Now this was prior to 3.2 or 3 X, basically prior to that X of Spring Boot version. Now after Spring Boot 3, the latest version which are there right now, we can use by creating using the @b by using the security filter chain, which is the newest way to define those particular security. Now this will allow you to configure certain authentication details, authorization details, CSRF protections, and other security aspect, whatever it is required when you are dealing with security of your application. Now, Spring Boot also provides certain properties which can be defined in your application.properties or application.yml, which will have some basic security settings basically. Okay. I hope these particular details are clear to it. I hope this video was helpful to those guys who are preparing for an interview, and also who are trying to learn the concepts of Spring Security, because this is one of the important concept when it comes to Spring Boot or the latest tech stack which Java related technologies people are working on. And this is one of the norms, I would say. This is a must thing which is every developer must know. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, and also share it with the needy people who are willing to learn and also try to explore the Spring security concepts.